Hello and welcome everybody to this webcast. This webcast is based on a session that I presented at the European SharePoint conference earlier this year in February of 2013, and this is a shortened version. So we're going to follow exactly the same format of slides and demos that were presented at the conference. We're just going to cut it round about halfway just because the webcast needs to be a little bit shorter. But I'm going to put all of the slides and all of the demos and so on up available on the internet, so you can download all of those. And of course you can get in touch with me. I'll have my contact details appearing on the slides as well if you have some follow-up questions or you'd like a little bit more information. We're going to be talking about REST and OData and all of those kind of things, and explain a bit about what those are during the course of the session. But before we do, I thought it might be worthwhile to explain a little bit about who I am and where I come from. I can't interact with you guys, unfortunately, because this isn't a live presentation, but I'll hopefully at least give you a bit of information about who I am and where I come from. So my name is Hilton Giesenow, as you can see on the slides. I come from right down at the bottom of Africa, a place called South Africa. Perhaps some of you have been there. If you haven't, I'll give you a super quick introduction to where I come from. So we have all kinds of amazing wildlife and animals and amazing scenery down this side of the world. The so to speak big five that people come to see on the land when they come out here. We also have sharks. We have different kinds of sharks. This is one of our main rugby teams. We are very keen on our rugby, our cricket, and our soccer. Very, very big fans of our soccer, as you can see from this gentleman. We also have amazing scenery and winelands and beach life and all of that kind of stuff as well. All kinds of characters hanging out on the beach, as you can see. In particular, I'm from a city called Cape Town, certainly one of the most beautiful areas of the country. Perhaps some of you either saw South Africa or even traveled to South Africa for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. You can see our fancy new stadium that was built for the World Cup. And just a stone's throw away is my house, the area that I live in. So as you can imagine, I spend a lot of my time staring at the ocean, hanging out on the beach, and so on. However, when there is some work to be done, I work at a consultancy called Experts Inside. We're a global consultancy, and I are obviously based in the South African division as well. So you can see our address on the bottom there, www.expertsinside.com. You can see my email address as well, hg@expertsinside. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for SharePoint, and I host a SharePoint podcast called themosshow.com. So you can see the web address and my Twitter address down on the bottom there is as well. So feel free, as I said, to get in touch with me after the show, after you've been watching it, if you do have any follow-up questions. Okay, with that, let's jump into the actual content of what we want to cover in this session. So if you go back to the early days of SharePoint and imagine you were creating something like, let's say, a web part or a customized page or a timer job or so on. In this situation, you're sitting on the server side. You're effectively living inside of SharePoint. And as a result, via the server object model, SharePoint is effectively an open playing field. You can get access to pretty much everything inside the innards of SharePoint in order to be able to extend it and customize it and so on. However, if you're coming from a remote application, let's say some kind of Windows Forms application or a mobile application or something like that, back in the earlier versions of SharePoint, you were pretty reasonably locked out. There was, in fact, only one way that you could access SharePoint in the, let's say, 2007 timeframe, for example. And that was primarily via the web services, via the ASMX SOAP-based web services. Now, this wasn't necessarily such a terrible picture. One of the questions that I asked in the live session of this topic at the conference was how many individual ASMX endpoints there were. And the right answer to this question, as you can see on the screen, is that in 2007 there were 35 individual distinct ASMX endpoints, and each of these services has at least one method or operation that you could call as well. So potentially things weren't as bad as they seem. Maybe you think, like our good friend Borat, that it was all good, and perhaps things weren't as terrible as I'm making out. I'm sure that at least some of you watching this webcast were using those web services and were able to get a lot of work done. However, there were a lot of drawbacks and there were a lot of pain points. So I can't, unfortunately, interact with you directly. I'm sure that you have some feelings on the matter. But some of my personal takes on these are that, for example, these web services were, in the more traditional sense of the term web services, they were SOAP-style web services. Now, SOAP is quite a bloated protocol. In the beginning, it initially stood for Simple Object Access Protocol, but in today's form, it's become anything but simple. Particularly if you take SOAP and you're looking at a secure transaction with some of the WS star security standards and reliable messaging, for example, and atomic transactions and so on. An individual call can in fact be made up of a huge number of backwards and forwards pieces of the conversation, and it's a very chatty protocol in that instance. So it's quite a bloated approach to doing things. In fact, in case you can't identify exactly what's what, that's the SOAP protocol, and down on the bottom here is the poor lowly SharePoint developer trying to get some of his work done. So that's one of the issues with SOAP. Another aspect to it, though, is that SOAP is very limiting. SOAP, by definition, is an RPC, or remote procedure call type of protocol. So that means we're exposing our procedures or our methods remotely, and we very distinctly define the signature. So as an example here, we have a method called getClientById. It explicitly takes in an ID and returns a client. So we're quite explicit in terms of the method, its name, and the overall signature in terms of what parameters it takes, what types they are, what return type it is, for example. If I wanted, for instance, to have a getClientById and region to extend this, for instance, I'd have to add a new method or be very careful about how I deploy and not break existing customers. I'd have to add another region parameter and so on. I've got to be quite explicit about how I go ahead controlling my API. Now, in SharePoint, this is exacerbated, if you like, because by its very nature and by its very power, SharePoint is a flexible and dynamic system. So there's no way that Microsoft could themselves provide a beautiful dynamic API to match anything we could possibly conceive of and construct inside of a SharePoint system. So the problem is exacerbated because not only do we have to have a defined API, but that API needs to somehow be fixed and flexible at the same time. So in SharePoint, we end up with this charming set of methods, for instance, like getListItems, that takes in a kind of XML GUI, where we can go ahead and define camel queries, for instance, and it returns an XML GUI, which we need to pull apart and deal with and quite painfully manipulate and so on to get all the data out. So this is quite a difficult and painful exercise in earlier versions of SharePoint. And around the 2010 SharePoint, or SharePoint 2010 timeframe at least, Microsoft realized this was a problem and decided to try and tackle this problem and make it a lot less painful for us by introducing a new API style. However, they realized when they wanted to tackle this that there was no need to reinvent the wheel. There was a lot of good stuff available, either on the SharePoint side or in the sort of open web standard marketplace, if you like. So what Microsoft did, instead of introducing a single new API, is in fact to go ahead and introduce two new APIs. First up, in 2010, we had the client-side object model. And the goal here was to leverage people's experience and understanding of the server-side object model. And so you'll see it looks quite similar to a server-side SharePoint API instruction. We have, for example, a camel view defined in XML there, for example. We go to the list and get items against the list, for example, and we get that off of the web and so on. However, at the same time, emerging and growing in influence across the web development world was this concept of REST. REST has been around for a very long time, and I'll explain a little bit of the detail of it in a moment. But essentially, we see here an example call, and this is executed from JavaScript. Both of the examples here we see are from JavaScript. And the idea here is to go ahead, hit a specific URL, and go ahead and retrieve the SharePoint list data. As I said, this is the 2010 version. We'll see a service there called listdata.svc. In 2013, things that still exist, but things are a little bit different. We have some new things available that we'll see in a moment. But essentially, we see the style here of effectively just making an asynchronous JavaScript call. We can see this is a jQuery example, so we're calling the Ajax method, for example, and working with the data when it comes back. Now, the client-side object model approach is especially for seasoned SharePoint developers, perhaps a little bit more familiar. We've obviously got a new API to learn and libraries and so on, but the concepts are quite familiar. We might not all be familiar, however, with the concept of REST and the protocol load data and so on. So I'm just going to take a moment here to actually give you a little bit of background. Obviously, for time reasons, we're not going to dive too deeply into it, but it's worth having a bit of an understanding of how some of these things hang together. So the idea behind REST dates back to at least a decade or so, to a doctoral dissertation by a fellow named Roy Fielding, who was one of those who worked in the very early days on the web. So he's got a long history in working with the internet and working with the web in particular. And so he had this great idea that essentially said everything on the internet can be effectively uniquely addressable by a URL. So for example, if we go to Amazon.com or any large e-commerce site, for example, every catalog and every product in every catalog pretty much can uniquely be addressed by a URL. So we can copy the URL to a particular book we're interested, for example, email it to our friends to go ahead and have a look. And he said we could extend that same concept to the idea of accessing resources in a data source without it necessarily needing to be on a web page for an e-commerce site, for instance. Data inside of systems can be exposed using a similar URL or URI kind of structure. So that's part of it, and it also relates to working with the HTTP stack more natively, and certain of the verbs there like get and put and pull get and put and delete and merge and so on. But things that have been in the HTTP model for a long time. And that's part of what the REST story is about. However, if you recall from SOAP, the P part stood for protocol. REST is not a protocol. It's more of an architectural style or approach to communications on the internet. So, building on the concepts of REST, Microsoft, together with a number of other companies, got together and put together an actual practical on-the-wire implementation of REST in the form of something called OData. You can go to odata.org and find out a little bit more about it, but essentially what it does is it takes the REST concepts, implements it in an actual usable protocol, and extends it with a lot of capabilities as well. So, for example, it introduces things like querying directly within the URL address, querying, sorting, filtering, ordering, etc. So it introduces a huge amount of additional capability, not just syntax, but capability into the concepts of REST and makes it practical. However, that's enough theory and enough slides. As my good friend Jerry Maguire says, let's actually see some of this stuff in action. So we're going to switch over now and see some actual practical demos of some of these things running. So I have here a 2013 SharePoint site. And you can see I can load up the site. It's got a couple of lists that we're going to deal with. It's got, for example, a projects list, and each project in our fake consulting company, for example, relates to a specific contact. I also have quite a large list just to demo later how we can work with volumes and how some of that's represented via the services. So it's got a little over 1,000 items, and each item is just named directly based on a sample count. So inside of the site, what I can do now is go ahead and look at the actual REST service inside of SharePoint. I mentioned there were two that we're going to be dealing with. There's one that comes from the SharePoint 2010 timeframe, and that's one called listdata.svc inside of the VTI bin magic folder that all of the services live in SharePoint. And if I hit that list directly, you'll see a representation of all of the lists that are available inside of the site. So it's very well named. It is directly bringing up list data, and I can go into one of those lists in particular. So let's go ahead, for example, into the projects list. You saw there were 2 items in that list, so if I go ahead inside here, we can go ahead and see 2 items directly in there. Let's just zoom in to make things a little easier. So you can see I have 2 entries in this list being reflected here directly. Now I can actually go ahead and browse inside that. So for example, I can browse into project 2. You may have seen the address of that item appearing here, and it gives me the ID in this atom syntax, for example. So I can browse there directly, and I can see all of the values for all of the properties in this list item. I can also browse directly into one of them. So for example, you see title there, but I could go down into title directly. Notice that this stuff is case sensitive, so if I had title with a lowercase t, it wouldn't find it. But I can browse down to one particular property. I can see the entire item at a higher level as well. But the implementation of this service as well also gives me the ability to see related items. So I can get an href to them as well, and I can see that if I, for example, append contact onto the address, I can actually browse into the contact for that particular project. So you can see here, for example, Bob Jones is the related entity. And under the ID, I could see that I could browse it directly, but in this case, I'm browsing it via the relationship and getting access to that. And I could, for example, go down in there again. I can go ahead and see, for example, the created by. You can see that was represented by a relationship there as well. And once again, I can go ahead and see the properties on this as well. So that's a kind of a key concept of the actual REST data appearing inside here. But as I mentioned, we can start to do very clever things like filtering as well. So for example, let's go ahead and just work with a simple filter for now. And I can go ahead and say, show me all projects. So not just a particular item number 2, but all projects, however, with the filter that the title starts with A. So for example, you can see I have a project here called another project. And so that filtering allows me to bring that up as well. I can also do some ordering, for instance, but one of the other things I can do is to go ahead and select just specific fields. So for instance, instead of all of that data coming back, I can go ahead and ask just for 2 particular properties. So you'll see of all the properties that were coming back before, I've now specifically asked only for title and ID. But notice also that the relationships have been removed as well, because I'm explicitly asking only for a subset of the data. So that's how we can see the response directly in the browser. And obviously we can do that in Fiddler as well. If any of you are familiar with the Fiddler tool, it's an HTTP debugging proxy here. So I can go ahead, for example, and execute that call in the browser and see the results here in Fiddler as well. So obviously we see just exactly the same thing, the actual raw XML there. We can see the headers and response as well, for instance, but I can see the raw XML. The reason I'm doing this though is because I want to show you something specific. I want to go ahead and replay this call, so to speak. I'm going to reissue the same call, but this time I'm going to go ahead and ask it to return a specific type of format. So I'm going to ask for application JSON, and I'm going to ask for the OData. Oh, where did the mouse go? There we go. The OData format to come back on that JSON. So let's go ahead and hit that again. And this time, let's just decode the SSL. This time, you'll notice that JSON data is coming back. So it's as simple as just changing the correct HTTP header to go ahead and get JSON data to come back this time instead. So that's great to see how the data is returned and how we can access the items in the list using that URL syntax. However, being an API, we want to access it programmatically. So let's have a look at how we can go ahead doing that. In the first example, I'm just going to make a direct call using a web client to go ahead and download the data. I'm using a slightly derived version of the web client, one called Claims Web Client, and you'll see a few classes in here. This is just because I'm working against Office 365, so I'm using some great sample code that's available from Victor Weiland's blog. You can go ahead and get that in the code samples. And he's got assistance just in doing the authentication. But let's go ahead and see how all of that works. So I'm going to go ahead and run the sample and step through here. We can see I'm going to just fire up that client, go ahead and hit that same projects list that we saw before. So if I do that and I have a look at the output here, once it's done all of the authentication and so on underneath, we should go ahead and see that XML response written out directly. So let's switch over there and we can see exactly what we saw in the browser appearing in the console window. So we can access the data just using, for example, a raw web client request. However, that's of course only slightly useful. We can take that a huge step forward by going ahead and actually having Visual Studio generate a proxy for us. So I can go ahead, for instance, and say add a service reference, and I'm going to leave Fiddler turned on again in this case because I want to show you something specific. But I can go ahead and say hit that site and go ahead and build a proxy for me to make working with this site a lot easier from code. So let's just log in here very quickly. Let's go ahead and sign in. And once it's done so, it should be able to go ahead and help me identify a context and all of the items I want to work with. So for example, you'll see projects and random stuff and all of the lists that we want to work with. Notice, however, that when I pasted in the address, I didn't specifically ask for listdata.svc. Visual Studio has gone and converted my request. It's detected that I'm going to SharePoint and gone ahead and made a reference to that directly. And in fact, in Visual Studio, or in Fiddler at least, apologies, in Visual Studio, you'll notice that it's actually gone and specifically requested not just that service, but it's appended a metadata query onto the end of the query string there. And you can see it gets the metadata for all of the items in the list. So that Visual Studio is able to go ahead and generate a proxy for me. Having that proxy enables me to write a very simple link query, or very explicit link query to, or implicit link query, I guess is probably the most correct term, that would go ahead and convert a very simple C# example into a very complicated URL that it's going to call for me underneath. So let's go ahead and just step down into that example and step through inside there. And you'll see that we can go ahead and write a very natural link query and have that translated into an appropriate call for us. So I have an event handler hooked up to the data context here so that it will go ahead and get the cookies all set up for me correctly, but also it'll go ahead and write out the URI that it's going to hit. Remember that using this style, the URI effectively embodies the query. So we can go ahead here and see the query that's been executed. It's doing a filter where the title starts with S, where start date is this, and order by is that, and so on. And it's going ahead and actually converting that link to WCF Data Services query into an actual URI that we can work with. Let's just finish running that sample, and you can see all of the results written out there as well. So that's how easy it is to go ahead and use the 2010 REST services from in our code. Now we can see that in JavaScript as well. I'm going to give you a JavaScript example of some of these things running as well. But before we do, I want to show you the 2013 service that's available to us as well. So also in VTI bin, we have a new service called client.svc. And you'll see though that this is a very, very different beast from the one that we had before. First of all, notice when I go to the root, it gives me an error because it's not sure what I want to do. Remember, listdata.svc gave us a lot of information, but it was list data. So all it gave was lists. Using this new service, I can go ahead, for instance, and get access to information on the site collection. So for example, a bunch of properties you can go ahead and see here. For instance, I can go ahead and access data on the web that I want to work with. So I can go and get the URL, the title. For instance, I can see which template it was created from somewhere inside there. There we go, the web template, and so on. And from here, I can go to lists. One of the relationships up at the top there was the lists off of that web. I think it's, there we go. We can find it inside of there, and so on. I can also go to lists directly though, just as a shortcut. Inside here, I can go ahead and get data on all of the lists as well. But let's go and see one of the lists specifically. We can look at that project list again. And notice this time also when I go to the root of the list, it no longer gives me the items. What it's giving me here is data on the list itself. So again, things like title and URL and so on. One very useful one is the item count. It shows me that there are 2 items in this list, for instance. And I can go ahead from here into the actual items if that's what I want to see. So inside the items collection, we can go ahead and get those 2 items coming back once again. Notice a number of other relationships here, so things like get the field values as text, as HTML, and so on. A lot of great extensions here. And of course I can go ahead and do my, my querying on the URL there again. So that's how the new service works, and in fact there's a nice little handy shortcut just to make it easier to type and to shorten the URL as well. Instead of that service endpoint, we can go to _API, and you'll see this works exactly the same. It's just a nice shorter way of writing access to this REST service. From within Visual Studio, I've got a page that goes ahead and uses this service. So this is a page embedded in a SharePoint site. That's important. It's not just an HTML page executing JavaScript. It actually lives in the same site. That affects some of the authentication. Unfortunately, we won't get a chance to touch on that in this video, but it's in the slides. You'll see some mention of that as well. Inside of here, though, as the page loads, you'll see if I refresh it, it goes and gets some data from one of the lists, in this case the contact list. So as soon as it's finished loading here, you'll see it actually go ahead and load that data. It's a little slow here just because it's the first time it's fired up for a little while. But as soon as the page loads, it goes and does that JavaScript request. So what it's doing here is on the document ready, again just using jQuery, it's going and executing a sample very similar to what we saw in the slides. It's going to a specific list, getting its data, passing in the fact that we want JSON data in this case, executing a GET request, for example, and then when the call executes successfully, it goes ahead and just loops through the results as an array. Notice that the results come back via a specific list of properties on the return element. And that's, in a nutshell, all there is to actually going ahead and making the call via the REST service. However, if that's all there was to it, obviously things would be very simple, but there's a little bit more to it as well. First of all, what we've seen is that we now have 2 services that we can call, 2 extremely powerful services. We have the REST service and we have that client-side object model as well. In fact, things get even more interesting because the new REST service in 2013 in fact lives together with the client-side object model. Many of you who may have used the client-side object model, the CSOM, will have referenced the appropriate .NET library, for example, or JavaScript library. But underneath, it's actually calling client.svc. And in fact, if we were to decompile the actual client.svc service, you can see on the top the original REST or the original CSOM query, this process query method, and we now have a new one called process REST query. So these 2 distinct services are actually physically living within the same endpoint. Now, some of you might remember the Batman movie from a little while ago, and you remember the character Two-Face, and this is very much a case of that. The fact that everything lives all together is both good and bad, just like Two-Face. So the good part means that the fact that these are now merged means that it's given Microsoft the opportunity to vastly extend the surface area of both of these services. On the REST side, for instance, remember we had list data.svc, which brought back just what it claimed to bring back, whereas now we have access to the site, the web, and a huge number of other things as well. Things like user profiles, search, social data, taxonomy, and all of the other things you can see listed here, a huge amount of data. And that's a great advantage to us. It means things like there's a Windows Phone API for working with it and so on. And it gives Microsoft a chance to consolidate their efforts on really extending the footprint rather than spending too much time working on 2 distinct APIs in distinct areas. However, there's some drawbacks as well. So on the one side, for example, although there's a very strong parity between the 2 services, CSOM still seems to have a little bit more of a deeper reach. Some of the things like taxonomy fields don't seem to work as well in the REST service right now. In addition, it feels a little bit less RESTful. which is a term kind of bandied about in the REST community. But in this instance, what it means is that, for instance, off of the list data.svc, we could go /projects and go ahead and get the data there. Whereas on the new client.svc implementation, we have to go and ask for get list by title, or off of lists we go get by title and ask for projects. So we're sort of introducing method semantics, almost a little bit of a throwback back to SOAP. So it feels a little bit, so to speak, less resty or less restful. In addition, some important points are that the SharePoint 2013 data services, the OData REST services, are not entirely in compliance with the actual OData spec. There's a little touch of irony there, of course, being that Microsoft were a big part of the OData protocol itself. But some of the things, for instance, are that things like sorting and paging and so on work a little bit differently. Some of them aren't implemented. Some of them work a little bit differently to how you might have expected. The biggest one for me, most important for me, is that the metadata endpoint that we looked at on that list data.svc through Visual Studio is not available for the 2013 data services. Now, it was available in the preview, both on SharePoint Online and the downloadable preview of SharePoint 2013. It was pulled out for RTM, and it seems like it's coming back in the more recent versions of SharePoint 2013 in SharePoint Online. However, it still doesn't work directly from Visual Studio. So hopefully this is something they are working with. And as I mentioned, for example, in terms of compliance, the spec here indicates that it must be exposed. But unfortunately it isn't. So it looks like Microsoft is still working on extending and improving the REST services. But in particular, this one for me is quite a drawback, because it means we don't get to have very nice to work with proxies in Visual Studio. If we are working with list data, we can go ahead and still use list data.svc, even if it's just to help us craft the final filter to pass to the newer client.svc or _ API, if you like. So, if we take that a step further, I'm still giving, being that I'm giving this talk, I guess you probably could have guessed ahead, but I'm still a proponent of the REST services. I still prefer the REST style, or the REST option versus the CSOM option. So let's look at some of the reasons why. First of all, I find the development style more intuitive. My background prior to SharePoint is more on the web development side. So although the CSOM approach is perhaps more familiar to SharePoint developers in terms of things like the server-side object model, for example, I find the style of the REST service a lot easier to work with. And if you have a look at the code in the download for this talk, we can actually cut this down to one line of code by simply defaulting a lot of the parameters there. In fact, if I take a moment just to show you that in Visual Studio, you'll see for subsequent calls, I can go ahead and requery the data just with one single line of code, for example, just by setting up defaults using some clever things inside of jQuery, doing a default setup. So the style feels more natural to me working on the web, and it's quite a bit more concise as well. If you take that a step further as well, it also means that existing developers, so perhaps developers, ASP.NET developers, or even PHP or completely other platform developers that we're bringing to SharePoint developers that we may need to integrate with our SharePoint environment, or potentially even bring onto the SharePoint team, it's going to be a lot easier to have them skill up on a REST approach, because they're more likely to have used REST on some other project or in some other platform than they are, of course, to have used the client-side object model, which is very specific to SharePoint. In addition, the strong typing, I've put it in braces here because it's available in the 2010, the list data.svc service, or shall I say list data.svc. 2010 is not entirely correct. It is fully available in 2013, as you saw. But it's not yet available, or not yet entirely working in the _ API option as well. So hopefully that's coming soon. I've put it in as a tremendous strength in terms of working with that API, because if we do get it back working again, it's significantly more productive and more intuitive. For example, having IntelliSense and Link to help us craft our queries. And finally, a very interesting one: if you are building Windows 8 apps, This is not Windows 8 desktop apps, but Windows 8 RT apps. So for example, to run on a Surface tablet, then the client-side object model is not actually available to you. Some of the things that the .NET implementation of CSOM requires don't or aren't actually available on this particular stack. So it means you're actually going to need to work with the REST approach, or the REST services, to go ahead and access your SharePoint data. That's all, unfortunately, that I'm going to have a chance to show you in this session. We were going to have a look in a follow-up session, or as the second part of this talk, at some of the pitfalls and avoiding some of the common performance problems and so on, working across the wire, and particularly working in the REST service. And we would also have had a look at some of the other CRUD methods. So we've looked particularly at read, and we would have focused on how to do creates, edits and updates, and deletes as well. Edit has a few interesting aspects to it. And there are some general things that you need to be aware of, for example, in terms of things like cross-domain access and so on. Also very important in terms of the new app model in SharePoint 2013 is understanding how to authenticate and work with these services, especially again across domain. So if you're interested in seeing the second half of this talk, then get in touch with me or get in touch with the European SharePoint Conference guys, and send them a follow-up and say that you'd love to hear the second part, and I'd be most delighted to go ahead and put it together for you. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Again, also feel free to contact me with queries on what you have seen here or on any of the follow-up material as well. Thanks for watching.